Hello, everyone. You are at the webinar, Making Green Building Financing Mainstream. A few words before we begin. This is hosted by Responsibility, which is an impact asset manager with 16 years of on-the-ground experience in emerging and developing markets. And Responsibility manages the Global Climate Partnership Fund, which is also hosting. And the Global Climate Partnership Fund uses public funding to leverage private capital in order to mitigate climate change and drive sustainable growth in developing and emerging markets. This is also hosted by Thinkstep, and the Thinkstep SGS consortium is one of IFC's global certification partners for EDGE. Operating as a one-stop shop for EDGE certification, clients are guaranteed a straightforward and transparent process, one contract, an all-inclusive price, and expert advice. So, a little housekeeping. If you look to the right side of your screen, you have some handouts. One is the complete presentation that you can download. And there is also a Thinkstep brochure. Also, everyone is muted. So if you have a question, you can at any time just type it into the chat function on the side of your screen. And we will get it to one of the we will either answer it immediately or we'll save it for one of the designated Q&A sessions. So I'm going to hand over to our presenters now. We have David here, a carbon impact specialist at Responsibility, and also Eleni, an EDGE program manager at Thinkstep. All right, handing the presentation over to Eleni.
Thank you very much. Welcome, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, wherever in the world you are. Today, we're going to be talking about green building financing and really delving into why green building financing is interesting for financial institutions and how financial institutions can really get involved. But before we get started in our deep dive, we want to take a quick little poll and understand where our audience is coming from. So take a moment, we're just going to launch a poll now, and let us know if you have financed a green building before. And if you're unsure, that's okay. There's an option for that too. Give us a minute while we fix the technical. All right. Hopefully this also gives some of our late joiners a little opportunity to come on in and join us for this webinar. All right, we are going to close the poll and show the results. So the majority of our audience has not financed a green building before, which means you're definitely in the right place because we're going to go through how you can get involved and why it makes a compelling case. So in 2015, we saw a historic agreement of all nations coming together to solve climate change and coming to the realization that to really address and mitigate the worst impacts of climate change, we really need to keep net zero emissions by 2050 and maintain a global level of warming of an average of 1.5 degrees Celsius. That was further amplified by the IPCC report that came out in October of last year, which really showed the difference of even a half degree of warming and really emphasized the importance of decarbonization for the whole world. Now, on a high level, that's a lot of work that we need to do between now and 2050. In order to be able to meet net zero emissions by 2050, we have to halve current emissions by 2030 and reach that net zero by 2050. Now, for all of us working in the sector, that's no easy feat. And traditionally, the sectors that get the most attention in terms of decarbonization are the energy, large infrastructure, and transportation. And there's a reason for that. Those are highly carbon-intensive industries. But an area that's really interesting and typically doesn't come on the radar is buildings. Buildings have a significant impact on global warming. So they actually contribute 15% to global greenhouse gas emissions. And that's coming from two different areas. On the one hand, there's the greenhouse gas emissions emitted during the construction or the putting up of the building. And then there's the emissions from the operation of the building. So the energy that's being used to run the building, as well as the other resources that are being used, such as water. So you can see on your screen, buildings account for 33% of the world's energy use and 40% of water use. So really there's a significant opportunity for the financial community to address impact and really focus on buildings. Now there's also changing regulatory landscapes. So we talked about net zero emissions by 2050. To be able to achieve that, we need to put the regulations in place to make sure that all new construction meets those regulations so that the buildings put up between now and then are green and are forward-looking. What that translates to is that every new building built needs to be zero carbon by 2030, and all existing building stock around the world needs to be refurbished to meet net zero carbon by 2050. That requires a large amount of investment. And the issue of refurbishment is a big subject, which we won't get into too much detail today. But what we do want to focus on is the new construction that's going to happen. And what's interesting to note is that most of the new construction isn't going to happen in the Western developed world, but actually is primarily going to be driven by emerging economies. So you can see in front of you images from Kenya and Colombia today. There's massive growth and there's a continued need and demand for more infrastructure. I was just talking to somebody in Nigeria the other day, and there is such a demand for more housing units. There's a huge deficit, and so a lot of pressure on government and developers to really grow, and build. And whilst it's really important to make sure that we get that infrastructure in place, it's equally important to make sure that that infrastructure is not coming to a huge detriment to our planet. Because if we meet this huge demand without taking into account the planetary constraints, we'll have lost the game. So that really puts investors and the financial community in an interesting conundrum where there's a massive opportunity for development, a good opportunity for investment and impact, but also in quite challenging markets where something like green buildings may not have taken off just yet. In terms of the investment potential, the International Finance Corporation has estimated there's a 3.4 trillion investment potential in just the next 5 years. And if you look at the map, it's really focused on those areas that we mentioned. So huge growth opportunities in Latin America, throughout Africa and Southeast Asia. So there's a lot of opportunity here to be thinking about programs that help accelerate green buildings and using these green building programs to help decarbonize and really reduce global emissions. Where's the problem? The problem that we hear a lot from investors is the identification of a green building. So it's not a lack of understanding or awareness that green buildings have significant potential, but rather the sheer logistics of how does one get involved in this particular sector. In front of you, you have 4 images, 4 different buildings. Some of them are green and some are not. I'd like you to take a moment to really look through the images and think about which one is the green building. Now, if you assumed it was the one with the green wall, you're actually wrong. The green building in this slide is the top left-hand corner, a seemingly simple building, nothing that would differentiate it from the outside. And yet this building is highly resource efficient because it was designed with being green in mind. So this particular building has reflective solar paint on the roof to avoid overheating and a high use of cooling devices. There's solar hot water treatment at the top, so really capturing the power of the sun to heat the water. There's shading devices, and there's highly energy efficient ceiling fans, as well as water efficient faucets. Now, as a financier, it would be really difficult to know that just by looking at this image. And that really brings to question how the financial community can better understand and get to know what green buildings are and make sure that the investments they're making into this sector are really bringing additionality and really helping drive decarbonization forward. A green building can be defined by multiple different things. So on the one hand, a green building could be something with solar panels on the roof, really looking at self-generation. Green buildings can have special materials that go into the buildings that have lower impact, or buildings that have high levels of insulation and materials that mean that the temperature changes between the inside and the outside are not so extreme that they require high heating or high cooling. Green buildings could have highly efficient water faucets to ensure that water consumption is really optimized. Could have specialized HVAC systems, waste management, thinking about also what was there before the building was built. So some green building standards in particular might take into account the fact that perhaps a piece of land was cleared of part of a forest or of trees to put that building in place, in which case it may or may not affect the status of a green building. Another consideration could be transportation. Is this building in an area where you require a private vehicle to reach, or is it connected to a walkable community or connected to public transportation? Now, a green building could be one of these characteristics, 3, 5, or all. And that's quite challenging in terms of understanding the market landscape, because when the definition is not clear-cut, it's challenging to put investment into it. And also the landscape for green building certifications has also matched that, making it equally difficult to understand. So some green building certifications on the market focus on some elements of being a green building, and also classify the achievements of a green building in a way that's difficult to understand. So for example, we hear terminology such as excellent or gold or platinum, which delineate the achievement of a building, but make it difficult for an outsider who's not part of this particular community to understand exactly what that building has achieved. All of this has led to a more defined definition of green buildings, and that's really been led by the investor community to help address some of these challenges. So investors have come together and defined it as following. A green building is something that is 20% more efficient or with better performance than a local baseline. And the reason that's important is because it's quantifiable and a percentage is comparable. So you can really compare different scenarios and different examples around the world. And by bringing in the local baseline, you're also taking into account the local differences. So having an arbitrary number, let's say 10, whatever 10 means, that was coming out from one particular country may not apply to, say, sub-Saharan Africa or Peru, whereas having the percentage and integrating that with a local baseline is a quantifiable element, but still comparable and taking into account the local conditions that are going to affect how that building is constructed. The second element of an investor definition of a green building is that it's certifiable. And that's really important because anybody can stand up and say, my building is 20% more efficient than the local baseline. But unless you have that verifiable credibility and independence that a third party comes into, it's really difficult for a financial institution or investor to say, yes, I can release the funds and help support this building. And the last part is that all of this quantifiable information can be used for impact reporting. There's more and more pressure coming from the top, particularly driven by the Paris Agreement, but also the changing landscape for the investor community to have better impact reporting and really show the additionality of investments, really show how investors are helping to move the dial and move society towards a greener, more sustainable world through this impact reporting. Now, this definition was really the basis of how EDGE came to be. EDGE stands for Excellence in Design for Greater Efficiencies and was put together by the International Finance Corporation, IFC for short, who's the private equity arm of the World Bank Group. As an investor coming into the green building space, they really felt these difficulties in the market and really wanted to create a standard and certification agreement that could make green buildings more accessible to everybody. You might be thinking green buildings are something that is a luxury good or something that's quite complicated and costly. And IFC really wanted to change that narrative and really address that issue whilst also making it attractive for the investment community. So what they've done is they've launched the Green Building Standard, EDGE, but also a free software tool that goes hand in hand with EDGE. So EDGE as a standard is very focused. We talked about the different elements of green buildings, from having solar PV to waste management. EDGE focuses only on 3 things, and they're primarily around resource efficiency. So to achieve the EDGE standard, a building has to be 20% more efficient on energy, on water, and on the embodied energy and materials. So that's really the energy that goes into creating the materials that go into the building, as compared to a local baseline. And this is level 1. If a client is interested in going to level 2 or 3, there's EDGE Advanced, which is a 40% more energy efficient than local baseline. And then there's also a 0 carbon level, which is really where the entire industry is going to be moving, as we said, up until 2050. Now, what's really exciting about EDGE is the free software tool. And when I say free, I do mean free. Anybody can log on, whether they're an investor or a developer or just a random person who wants to look at their building efficiency. And they can put in basic information on the tool and get a local baseline calculated for them. So typically, local baselines have been calculated through complex calculations of consultants on the ground, pulling together a lot of information to be able to understand what a typical building looks like in that particular region. But IFC has done that work for people. So what IFC did was they collected climate data, utility cost data, local energy codes and building codes for 150 countries around the world, and calculated all of these baselines that are ready to use on the software. What's even better is that they've calculated different baselines depending on the type of building that the developer or client wants to look at. So you can look at homes, you can look at offices, hospitality, hospitals, education, retail, warehouses, light industry. Pretty much any kind of building you might be thinking of is available in the software tool. What you're seeing in front of you is a preview of how the tool works. So after you go into the tool and put in some basic information about the building, such as the size or what it's made up of, you go into these different tabs, one for energy, one for water, one for materials, and you get a list of different measures that you could use in your building to improve the resource efficiency. So as you can see on the left, there's window to wall ratio, there's reflective paint, there's insulation, different characteristics that would help improve the efficiency. As a user selects different measures, the chart on the right is interactive and starts to show the percentage improvement on efficiency that measure would have to the particular building. Even better than that, the tool also gives you all of the financial data to help you make the best decision possible. So you not only get the percentage improvement of efficiency, but you can also see the incremental cost, the utility cost savings, the return on the investment, as well as the carbon emission savings. Data which traditionally hasn't been particularly accessible to users is now at the fingertips and can really help users make the best decisions possible and find the best measures that can really improve the efficiency and improve the sustainability of a building whilst also being the most cost effective. When the standard has been achieved, you see a pop-up right on the right, and then the client can put together documentation right through the app and submit it for audit and certification to get that third-party validation that this building is truly efficient. Now, from a financial institution perspective, and particularly for banks, EDGE is really attractive, not only because it's offering this quantifiable data that has typically been inaccessible, but it's also pushing banks to launch some of these programs to look at how they can do green construction finance, green mortgages, and help reduce their lower investment risk. So we talked, the regulation is changing. Things are going to be moving towards 0 carbon, and buildings that are not looking ahead are going to risk obsolescence. So by pushing buildings and real estate to go towards EDGE standard and to go towards these green buildings, it's really a lower investment risk for both developers and home buyers. And there's also the pressure on financial institutions from above that they need to diversify, that they need to be doing more about sustainability and really be quantifying the impact and showing that level of additionality. And EDGE provides a tool that can really help banks do that in an accessible way, in a way that can help them capture greater market share and really reduce the risk of gaining a bad reputation from not doing some of these initiatives, but also the policy risk of non-compliance. We're just going to take a moment now to do a quick poll. Looking at these different advantages of using EDGE and looking at green buildings, which one is the most relevant to you, or which one resonates most with yourself? Also, if you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat, and we'll take a moment as well to answer questions after this poll. Just one more minute and we'll share the results. All right, and the magic answer is lower investment risk and market recognition. So two particular areas that I think are of serious concern to banks around the world, and I think we'll get more into the specific details once we get into the specific offering from GCPF and technical assistance. But hopefully what we discuss here today is really going to help address these two concerns and give you a path forward for green buildings. So with that, we're just going to take a quick pause and see if there's any questions to answer right now before shifting into the technical assistance offering. It looks like either I'm very good at explaining or you guys are still processing. So we'll give you a few minutes for Q&A at the end. But for now, I'll pass it on to David, who's going to talk a little bit more about the GCPF technical assistance offering.
Thanks, Eleni. This slide may be familiar to those of you who are already part of the fund, but for those of you who are not, this is the main eligibility criteria of what kind of projects can GCPF finance. As Stacy mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, we can finance renewable energy projects, but also energy efficiency projects. But for energy efficiency projects, we need to comply with these three main criteria. At least 20% of energy or CO2 emissions should be safe compared to the baseline. And in this sense, EDGE is great because we already have a country-specific baseline for the different kind of buildings. Additionally, at least 75% of the sub-loan amount that you give to your end client should be invested in energy efficiency measures, which you also can identify in the software. As Eleni showed in the bar chart, you can see which measures are contributing to the savings. And finally, as for any project, you need to assess the ENS risk. ENS, I mean environmental and social risk. So this is a normal activity of the financial institution, and this is an assessment that you should provide to us. And we will double check with our internal experts. Keep in mind that we will do most of the paperwork through this partnership with Thinkstep and SGS. We will do the contracting and put the client in touch with them, but the client plays also a very important role. He will be the main contact point with the EDGE expert, which is a person that will help him to or her to prepare the assessment, evaluate the energy efficiency measures to be implemented, make suggestions. Then the auditors will come on site and visit the place to see if everything is there. And finally, the certification entity, in this case, Thinkstep, will do a final review before providing the EDGE certificate. This is, as Eleni mentioned, just a one-stop solution. So you will only interface with us and each one of the participants at each stage. How does this work? GCPF has a technical assistance facility, which provides funds for different things, trainings, capacity building, and in this case, a specific project assessment. If you as a partner institution have one client or one client comes to you with a green building project, just please reach to your main contact point. Could be an energy specialist or an investment officer. They will ask only a few bullet points of data like location, name of the client, what is the surface of the project, just the minimum data required to prepare the contract, and a short TA application, because we have an internal decision body, which is the Technical Assistance Committee, that will have a quick review. This normally doesn't take more than 1 week to approve the project and issue the contract. So the client can finance it. There is
A question here. From your experience, how open are financial institutions in accepting self-assessed EDGE projects as a basis for investment decisions in emerging markets?
We'd say that as for GCPF funding, it will be a start point to see if the project is eligible or not. But of course, it's an internal decision of the bank. There is not only based on the energy savings that you can see in the pre-assessment. Of course, as Eleni mentioned, the incremental cost, the savings could be also taken into account to estimate the credit risk of the client. Of course, this client will save that amount of money that won't pay to the utility company, or will save money also in the construction cost of the building. And some institutions take that into account when defining the product to the client, like setting the interest rate, the tenor, guarantees. So this is extra information that the credit officer of the institution will have to evaluate the project. Just to go back to the process flow, the EDGE process has a different stage. There is a pre-assessment, as you mentioned. There is, of course, the design and on-site audits, and at the end is the certification process. Could you go back one, please? Sorry. GCPF, through the technical assistance facility, will cover the full cost of this process, with the exception of the certificate itself, which represents less than 20% of the total cost. This will be assessed in a case-by-case analysis. Could be covered also by us, but it needs to be assessed in a case-by-case, and the final decision is on the TA committee. Just to show an example, if you have a new building, you will need a pre-assessment. You will have a chance to modify some elements of the design or incorporate measures. There will be a design audit by SGS, and then the certification entity, in this case Thinkstep, will do the review and issue a preliminary certificate. After the construction, there will be, again, our site audit to see if all the measures that you say in the pre-assessment that will be implemented are there physically. And again, Thinkstep will have a second look, final review, and issue the final certificate. Normally, if you work with GCPF, the way we did this before, it was a local energy auditing company, a local energy expert, and of course, it provides a lot of value because they know the local reality of the market, but it takes a lot of time. They need to set the baseline, specific for every project, and in this way, EDGE reduce a lot of time for this process. Also, it's a standard baseline, so you can mention EDGE in LATAM or in Southeast Asia, and people know what it is. And the certification also is an incentive for your client to show off a little bit, because in the previous way, or in the standard way, if you still want to do it, you just get an energy audit report with the savings, and in this case, your client will get in addition to that, and certificate to show that his commitment to the Paris Agreement or climate change mitigation. For existing buildings, this is a question we get a lot. Is it still possible? Of course. In this case, only energy and water savings are considered because the materials are already there. You can have no decision on the materials. But the building needs to be at least not more than 5 years old. If the building is newer than 5 years, it will be considered a new construction. Compared to other certifications schemes, there is no operational performance required or monitoring, unless you want to apply for the EDGE net zero CO2 emissions, net zero carbon. In this case, of course, as you need to source renewable energy or like through green certificates of green energy, then every 2 years there will be a review on that part. And if you're doing a major renovation, again, the EDGE expert on the SGS will do a design audit to check the renovation part. This is one of the first case studies. Of course, for privacy reasons, the picture is not the real one. This is a house in Ecuador that we're working with to certify with a local partner institution there. The nice thing about this case is an individual. It's not a company, it's not an architect, it's not a developer. It's just one person that wants his new house to be green. He's working side on side with the bank to see what measures they can implement, because based on the pre-assessment, there was still some things to do to reach 20% in each of the categories. As you can see here, the major part of the savings comes from the efficient lighting, also from the efficient household appliances, which in Ecuador is a plus, because it's a market in which only very efficient appliances can get into the country. So this person get the most efficient ones amongst them. And there is still some work to do, for example, in water savings, as is not shown here. Now I leave the floor to Eleni, who will tell us about another nice story.
Yeah, absolutely. So we do have case studies from around the world. In order not to talk too much and give you all time for questions, we're just going to look at one more. But this one is Greenox, which is a social housing unit in the center of Istanbul in Turkey. As you can see, it's a very impressive building, and it has 170 units of 1 and 2 bedroom apartments, a mixture of ages of people that are owning and occupying these housing units. But what was really exciting is that this is really social housing, and it might not look at it like it from the exterior, but that's really going to show and fighting the argument that green buildings are very costly. Because if you're able to build social housing units as green and you're able to keep the pricing affordable, it's just another reminder that by designing buildings correctly and green from the start, you can do this at a very, very low incremental cost with a really short return on investment, but make resource efficient buildings accessible throughout the world. So this particular building has a variety of different measures, including high efficiency boilers. There's some solar PV on the rooftop, rainwater collection and grey water treatment on site. And they were able to achieve quite impressive results. So they got 35% energy efficiency savings, 42% water efficiency savings, and 41% on materials and embodied energy. So really quite an exciting project. And as you can see at the bottom, the residents were really quite excited about receiving EDGE certificates. Every unit got their own certificate, and it was a wonderful ceremony where everybody, it was just a joyous day to celebrate being able to access these units. And what's really great about energy efficient and water efficient units is that the benefits really directly go to the occupiers. So being able to reduce the utility costs means a lot of savings for those people.
As we saw on the poll before, market recognition was very important for you. And in this case, this is a very nice case, because as Eleni mentioned, every person, every house owner in this building get an own certificate. It's not only for the developer, it's not only something that will be in the main door. So every house gets its own certificate, and this is really great also for marketing purpose, because it will spread the word among the friends, family, or co-workers.
Absolutely. I really do see that as an important benefit of this third-party validation and of going for such a scheme. I think in the question that we answered earlier, there was this element of, the self-assessment, and is that credible or valid? And because it has the audit and the certification scheme to it, and because you have to remember, EDGE is backed by the World Bank. And so having an EDGE certificate gives the prestige and the support of IFC and the World Bank, and really can help elevate a lot of developers and really help build that credibility and trust that these buildings are really what they say they are. And it's really valuable for selling, it's valuable for having tenants, bringing in new tenants for office buildings. It can be used in a variety of different ways, but we have seen the value across the board in multiple projects. So I think we're going to stop there and take questions from you. Ask us anything and everything.
So first question, is technical assistance free when you're with GCPF? And if not, what is the average cost for a certificate?
Hi, David here. As we tried to explain before, the EDGE covers different steps. There is a registration fee, there is an audit fee, there is a fee for the EDGE expert support, and then finally is a certification fee. GCPF technical assistance will cover all the cost up to, with the exception of the certification fee. The certification fee will be assessed in a case-by-case, in case by case, and maybe depending on the additionality, a specific case situation, it will be covered too. That being said, there is a, just to answer the first part of the question, there is no price for this. There is no, it's just if you're a partner institution from GCPF, you will have technical assistance support, not only for this. And if you want to know the cost of the certification, I would say that Eleni can answer this, but it's also public, I think, in the IFC EDGE website, or at least a range. But just for you to know, the registration, audits, EDGE support, EDGE expert support, it's more than 80% of the cost. So we will cover at least 80% of the cost of the certification of a project.
Absolutely. So just for more specific pricing, so we split our costs between standard projects and non-standard projects. So a standard project is one building of a single use. So for example, a hospital, an office building, a warehouse. Or on the residential side, it's a building with up to 3 typologies, so 3 types of apartments, and up to 150 units. The total cost of everything that David mentioned for that is $10,400. And that includes basic EDGE expert support as well. For non-standard projects, so anything that falls outside of that category, we would require some more information to help to calculate it. But if you go to edge.thinkstep.com, you can fill out a form to get specific information on certifications. But in general, as David mentioned earlier, with our flowchart, GCPF is really leading on the answering the questions and pulling together the information. So we will show you a slide right at the end with a specific contact detail that you can send any inquiries for pricing and further information.
And we can discuss more about the other things, including the technical assistant offering. This is only a small part of that.
Well, there's a question about technical assistance here. Does technical assistance cover access to construction finance?
This is something I would prefer to check in case by case with our investment officer. I would say normally don't do bridge loans. This is a very specific case if you're asking about that, but it's something I would prefer to check with our investment officers.
Yes, and there'll be contact details at the end here that everyone can access. Because there's another question here: is there a way to get financing for implementing energy efficiency measures? Is there a way to get financing for implementing energy efficiency measures?
Yeah, of course. In this case, for this specific project with the Thinkstep, we were just talking about EDGE. But if you have it, let's say that just want to get finance to replace lighting in a warehouse, then this is a credit line your client wants. Then of course it could be financed out of the GCPF line if you're partnered with us. We have a huge portfolio in more than 25 countries with different kind of institutions that do SME finance, for example, and we finance energy efficiency machinery, production lines, but it's a totally different thing that, of course, we can discuss it. In this case, we wanted just to talk about green buildings, but it's just a small part of what we do.
So what is the average time from identifying a project until the certificate is issued?
That is honestly one of the most common questions we get. And unfortunately, the answer is a little bit complicated, but typically we'll say 2 to 3 months. And that's just taking into consideration the back and forth to get the information needed. Then we'll issue the contract, which would have to be signed by GCPF as well as the client, because David mentioned this earlier, but the client does maintain responsibility in terms of the information that's provided for the certification and taking ownership and responsibility that that information is accurate. Once the contract is signed, we need to do all the payment and get that sorted out up front. And then once the documentation is submitted for audit typically takes 2 weeks. Within those 2 weeks, the audit would either get sent back to the client for more information if there's anything missing, or it would get submitted for certification. Once it's submitted for certification, if everything goes according to plan, that's another 2 weeks. So by calculating some back and forth and approvals and everything, I'd say a safe bet is around 2 months. But it really does depend on the availability of documentation, the accuracy of the self-assessments, and just making sure that everything's going smoothly. If there are clients, however, that have tight deadlines or are trying to meet some kind of specific date, we really do our best to accommodate and make sure that we can help meet these.
So a very specific question here, is Poland an eligible country for this certification?
Unfortunately not. In this case, GCPF cannot provide finance to financial institutions in EU 28 countries.
However, Poland is one of the countries that's on the EDGE application. So if the project is interested in going for EDGE certification, it could be done. It just wouldn't be done through the GCPF technical assistance. So there's a drop-down list on the EDGE website, which is edgebuildings.com. And you can find if your country is on there and really see what options are available. And you can also see if there's any particular financial incentives in different countries if GCPF cannot access that particular market.
So there's no other questions. I believe we will say goodbye to everyone and thanks for attending. There's again, you can download the whole presentation on the right-hand side under handouts. You can contact us, as you can see on the screen right now, and you'll also receive a recording of the webinar via email as soon as we are finished. So have a lovely day, and I hope to see you at the next webinar.
Thanks, bye.